Hello, my friends. Our topic is the astrology of rock stars. And I've been doing this research on rock and roll musicians for a long time. This is an update towards the end of 2024. After doing some additional research and making some new discoveries about what's going on at the time of birth of someone who becomes a rock and roll musician. This research started in 2007. So this the initial research, and it was not on specifically rock and roll, it was on musicians in general. And then later on narrowed down to different genres of music with a lot of emphasis on figuring out what's going on with rock and roll musicians. So what happened in 2007 is I went through the Garcia database. This is a database of professional groups. It includes musicians, painters, scientists, actors, politicians, different professional groups who achieved very high recognition in their field. And so it's beautiful data, typically a few thousand charts in each category with times from a birth certificate. So I conducted this exploratory research. Can I see something in these charts that distinguishes painters from musicians, from scientists? And what I found was that in the charts of musicians, they had particular planetary combinations and vibrations 11, 22, and 44. And the planetary patterns are these five, the planetary pairs, I should say. Sun, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, Sun, Neptune, and Venus, Neptune. What we do when we try to find something in the data is we look for a formula, I often call it an astrosignature, a set of astrological variables that's consistent and fairly simple. So this is fairly consistent. It would even be better if I left out Jupiter, Saturn. If it was Sun, Saturn, and Venus, Saturn, and Sun, Neptune, and Venus, Neptune, then we have a fairly simple rule that Sun or Venus, let's see, Sun and Venus aspecting Saturn or Neptune. So you'd have Sun, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Sun, Neptune, Venus, Neptune in these three vibrations. And according to vibrational astrology theory, vibrations 11, 22, and 44 are very similar. So very similar vibrations, very similar planets. That is the kind of astrosignature that we want to build, because according to the principles of data mining, a simple formula is much more likely to be replicated when you collect new data. That's common sense. If you have a bunch of random things that are unrelated, it probably was just what happened to be in those charts. The big question is, will we find this again when we look at the charts of new musicians? So we build a formula. We try to discover what's there. We do not assume that we know. Now, I would have liked to leave Jupiter, Saturn out. I put it in because it gave better results. So this is the trade-off. You want to get good results. You want to show that the musicians, what was going on when they were born is very different from the other professional groups, but you want to keep it simple. So it's here, I included the Jupiter, Saturn because the formula worked better. It's still somewhat similar. It shares Saturn with the Sun, Saturn. I left it in there. So that's the formula. Fairly elegant, not perfectly elegant because of Jupiter, Saturn. And what were the results? Musicians versus scientists. So we create this formula of these planetary combinations, gave a probability less than 0.01. Musicians versus painters, P was less than 0.05. Musicians versus actors, P less than 0.01. This is all in an article, by the way, if you want to read the details of it. And by the way, if you are a platinum member, you have a special website page that helps you find all the videos. And you can go in there and type in Garcia, and you'll see the article, you'll find it. But if you don't, you could pause this thing, and it's a big, long website address. You could type that in, or you could go to YouTube and search for Research of Garcians by Santino Mancuso, something like that, see if you can find it. Anyway, that was the first step. So what was interesting about this first step in the research, vibrations 11, 22, and 44. And I remember in 2007 thinking, well, that makes sense because I already had the idea that 11, 22, and 44 were moving, kind of unstable. And so I thought to myself, wow, music is a dynamic art form. It's moving. Maybe, theoretically it seemed to work really good. This is how we just start sketching out crude ideas that actually fits the data. People have lots of rules for musicians. Taurus is good for music, or the certain house is good for music, or whatever. Well, go through the database and see if it's true. If we don't see it in the database, then we assume that's just an idea that astrologers had, but it doesn't work. Okay, so we come up with this first phase of research. Now, phase 2 was I went into Google and I did a search for greatest rock and roll musicians of all time, and I found this list of rock and roll musicians. I took all of them that have AA birth times. That's 13 people, and I looked to see what was in their charts. So let's see with some new data. I don't have a large database, but at least I can do this. And I found that Venus, Uranus, especially, and often Venus-Uranus-Pluto combinations were showing up in vibrations 11, 22, 44. I thought to myself, wow, rock and roll, Venus-Uranus. So it was not the same planets. And for all musicians, it was things like Sun, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Sun, Neptune, Venus, Neptune. But specifically for musicians, we're seeing this other set of planets. It's starting to get interesting. Maybe there's a particular planetary pairs for music in general, and then other specific ones for certain style of music. Because, rock and roll versus, you pick it, any other kind of music, folk music, whatever, very different. We'd expect different planetary configurations. So this is just exploratory research, just getting a feeling, can we find something in their charts with some consistency? And here we're coming up with the idea of 11, 22, and 44 vibration, and the planets involved. There may be some general ones that's true for all music, and some specific ones for rock and roll. We're just slowly building, piece by piece by piece, a model that will work. This is the kind of research that I'm involved in. It's slow, it's gradual, you build and build and build. If I go in there with an a priori assumption, musicians will have this, it never works. So we have to make a discovery first, little by little. Now, phase 3 is in 2020. I looked at those 13 charts in more detail because some of those charts, of those 13 people, they did not have Venus, Uranus, and Pluto in 11, 22, or 44 vibe. A lot of them did, but a few did not. So just looking at it, examining what's going on. Is it other planetary configurations, some other vibration? And so I modified the formula in 2020. And what I come up with specifically for rock and roll musicians is, again, Venus and Uranus in 11, 22, or 44. And then all three, add Pluto in. Sometimes you get all three, 11, 22, 44. Sometimes just Venus and Uranus. And then several of them had Venus and Uranus in vibrations 5 or 10. Now, maybe it's just a random fluctuation, but to help prevent that it's just a random fluctuation, it's only 13 charts, we see if it's theoretically consistent, and 5 vibration is something that we do find with creative people. So Venus and Uranus in this creative flowing vibration of 5 or 10, you can always double it and get a similar effect. It's a guess. It's like an educated guess. It's a reasonable possibility, not just based on personal experience and tradition. So looking at it closer, I also noticed Venus and Uranus were often in vibrations 8 or 16. That's consistent with theory. Our theories of vibrations 8 and 16 are fundamental driving things. Venus and Uranus are important. Then I noticed Venus and Uranus in 2 other vibrations. Those people who did not have Venus and Uranus in 11, 22, or 44. It showed up in 55 vibe a few times. 55 vibe, in theory, should be people who compose, arrange, songwriters. because it gives the combination of the 11 flowing, the creativity. Sure enough, the musicians who are inventive, creative, writing songs, etc. For example, among the musicians in that group was Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley did not write a lot of new music. He performed with tremendous emotion and charisma. You compare that to, say, someone like Bob Dylan, who writes tons of songs, and we see these differences that the songwriters have 55. And then some of them have Venus and Uranus in 35. And the 35 showed up especially very often for the ones who did not have it in 11, 22, or 44. Is there something in common about these musicians who have the 35? And 35 times 2, 3, 4, and 12 seems to be showing up pretty often. So this is our ideas. Then we have less powerful showing up once in a while, Venus and Uranus in vibrations 33 or 66. This showed up in people that are not really hard rock musicians, like the musician Donovan. Some of these were like very early, way back in the early 70s, musicians in the early development of rock and roll in this list of musicians that I found. But Donovan had the 33 and 66. We also saw it in some classical musicians like Vivaldi, whose music is also very flowing, which fits with 33 and 66, which we expect to be a little sweeter than the hard edge of 11, 22, or 44. So, and we use the same orbs for all these things, and we're starting to build ideas, noticing which people do not fit our original formula. Can we explain it little by little by little, trying to build a model. Phase 4, which actually started before phase 3 and continued, was just to look at any other musician's chart who was not in those 13. So the original 13 are Aretha Franklin, Bob Dylan, Buddy Holly, Carole King, Donovan, Elvis Presley, Grace Slick, Janis Joplin, Jerry Garcia, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Paul Simon, Tori Amos. Tori Amos is a little bit later. Paul Simon started way back and continued for a long time, but most of these are going way back. It was just the list that I had them. And then later I happened to find the charts of, just sort of randomly notice additional people that were, or I looked in the database, people that were not listed among the greatest of all time: David Bowie, Prince, Van Morrison, the Bee Gees, Barry, Robin, and Maurice, Gibb. All three of them we have AA data for. The Carpenters, Richard and Karen Carpenter, we have birth data for them. And then some people outside of the pop and rock genres like John Coltrane, jazz musician, and Vivaldi have AA data, looking at them and seeing if these principles work. And that's refining our understanding. I've made videos about David Bowie, Prince, Van Morrison, Bee Gees, the Carpenters. You can watch those videos. Several videos I mentioned John Coltrane, mentioned Vivaldi, and some of them. You can see there's a lot of information available on all these observations. So what is the result of applying the first 3 phases of research to just any other musician who we encounter as AA data? Seem to confirm it. These patterns are showing more often than they would randomly when we compare to a control group. So we're getting some support. The formula, however, is getting very complex. We've got all these different vibrations, and they seem to work in different ways. So here's phase 5. Add some additional rules to the astro signature. And looking at it more closely, among the original 13, Tori Amos, Jerry Garcia, and Jimi Hendrix did not fit the original formula very well of 11, 22, 44 vibration. They all have 35 vibe. Very strong, very interesting, and in some interesting patterns that are a little bit different from what we were looking at before. So we're just making observations to fit the model against a handful of charts. This is kind of a slow tedious way to proceed as opposed to having a large database and seeing what's in there. However, there are trade-offs. We don't have a large database of additional charts anyway, so we can't do that. But using your expertise as an astrologer, understanding the rules, you can help find things if you just remain consistent with the previous rules you had and see if you can refine them. So here we find these three musicians, and there's something that all three of these musicians have in common. Their talent is extraordinary by anyone's evaluation. Any person who's trained in music, reads their biography, listens to what they're doing, they have talents that are unbelievable. For example, Tori Amos was a child prodigy, playing piano at a very early age, etc. Some extraordinary abilities. Jimi Hendrix did things that nobody else could do. He could play with either hand. He could play with crazy stuff. So 35 we associate with the potential for unusual talent because the flow of 5, the discipline of 7, that they can practice, stay focused, and have this creative flow while they're doing it, gives a huge potential. So we're slowly developing a theory where we're not skipping anybody. We're not being selective. Can we get a model that fits all the people that we're looking at? So the 35 vibe, I have 4 points here. Number 1, 35 vibe inclines to versatility and mastery, and not specifically to any one genre of music. So we would expect these 3 people showing an interest in different styles of music, because 11, 22, and 44, that's hard, man. That's just, that's rock and roll. So we're expecting those people to be more likely to be hardcore rock musicians. We're expecting the 35 people might have had a lot to do with just the world they grew up in, the environment they were in. They're going to just move into anything because of the nature of 35. We see this with athletes with 35. They're talented in several sports. They pick one to specialize in. 35 is good at picking one to specialize in with a lot of versatility. And we can make good arguments that that's true for all 3 of these people. Additional rules that are coming up with just by looking at this data more carefully is that if you take Venus and Uranus, and with Mercury, Venus, Uranus often gives potential for facility playing an instrument for obvious reasons. Mercury's making associations, connections. People who just play fast and smooth with the rhythm, we'll see Mercury often involved. Another thing we've noticed over and over again, that Saturn can combine with Venus and Uranus. So Venus and Uranus are all often involved with music, rhythm, flow, excitement. Adding Mercury, adding Saturn seem to work. And what we see with the Venus, Saturn, Uranus people is a distinctive and original musical style. I also saw that with Barbra Streisand. I forgot to mention another person. I had actually looked at her chart prior to all this research. Way back, maybe it was after 2007, but it was a long time ago. And she has Venus, Saturn, Uranus tied up in 5 vibration and with some symmetry with midpoint structures. And she has a distinctive quality. She did something that had a unique quality to it. And also with the Saturn, you get this emphasis on precision, something distinctive and precise. So we're just finding additional things. The bad news about this is it's getting more and more complicated with so many possibilities. But nevertheless, we have to follow the data and see where it leads us. Number 4, a strong indicator of musical talent and motivation to pursue music is the 35 vibe or an overtone. So one of the things we're noticing with a lot of musicians is 35 times 2, times 3, times 4. Especially things like Mercury, Venus, Uranus, Venus, Saturn, Uranus, Venus, Uranus, Pluto. And an additional thing that was overlooked in the original research, but is consistent with other research, like our research on accidents, shows midpoint structures are very powerful. And so I created a rule that fits many of the musicians, which is you can have these planets in a 4-planet pattern. So if you have 4 planets in a 35 vibe or an overtone of 45, 4, of which 2 are Venus and Uranus, and the third one is either Mercury, Saturn, or Pluto, and the fourth one can be any planet. So it's a very specific rule. 4 planets in a 35 vibe or particular overtones of 35, which means 35 times 2, times 3, times 4. I'll give you that list in another slide. But the basic principle, 35 vibe, with 4 planets, 2 of which are Venus and Uranus. The third one is Mercury, Saturn, or Pluto, and the fourth one can be any planet. That will give musical talent across a wide range of kinds of music. Another thing that can happen, or the same 3 planets, Venus and Uranus with Mercury, Saturn, or Pluto, but instead of being in a 4-planet aspect pattern, they're part of a supersymmetry pattern. They're part of a supersymmetry pattern. And let me read this because I can't even remember the details of this. 3 planets are part of a supersymmetry pattern with at least 3 other midpoint structures. Okay, so what's happening is you have these 3 planets forming a midpoint structure. You add another planet. I'm going to show you this in great detail. This is going to take several videos to go through all of this. It's going to be a series of videos. I'm going to show you exactly what these supersymmetry patterns are like. They're fascinating. It's really, really interesting. I mean, they're really strong patterns. Supersymmetry means you add one more planet, you get another midpoint structure. So you're getting a midpoint structure is a symmetry pattern, and you're adding more planets and getting more and more symmetry lines. So you have these 3 planets with at least 3 other midpoint structures, or there might be 6 more midpoint structures with at least one of them. So let's see, or 6 or more midpoint structures and at least one of these 3 planet combinations, and at least one other midpoint structure has Venus and Uranus in it. So Venus and Uranus appearing in at least 2 midpoint structures. So you're getting this huge supersymmetry patterns. It's hard to explain right now until we actually look at them. And we'll go through that. So here's another way to understand this. In the 2020 rock music astrosignature, the one that was completed, I showed this to you before, the most powerful, least powerful, most powerful, less powerful, and least powerful. I already went over this. I'm highlighting that this Venus and Uranus in 35 times 2, 3, 4, or 12, as we look at this closer, that rule is really important and possibly needs to move up to the top. So that's what we're noticing. This showing up with a specific consequence. What's the consequence? Exceptional performance ability, very often. They're not powerful just because they have I shouldn't say just because, but they're not famous and exceptional because they just have a great voice. Their ability to, for example, play a musical instrument is extraordinary. They have this mastery. The 7 brings in the mastery, 7 times 5. So when that quality is apparent, you'll often see that it's a 35 instead of the harder edge of 11, 22, or 44, which is more hard rock. Venus and Uranus in 5 or 10 vibration gives musical inclinations of any kind. Okay, and we use a consistent formula, where the orb is proportionate to the vibration. In the vibrational chart, it's always 16 degrees. And if the music is a little softer, a little more flowing, not as hard edge, it could be 33 or 66 vibe. So in an evidence-based practice, it's important to apply theory. We go into databases, we build a model. Then you must apply what you've learned by examining the database to actual people. Very often this is in consultations, or in this case we're looking at biographies of people. So that in the field of psychology and medicine, this is emphasized tremendously. If you go to the websites of the American Medical Association or the American Psychological Association, they will tell you how they are evidence-based practices and the importance of the you might say scientific or evidence-based research, and then applying it and seeing what happens. So this is the, a lot of this research I'm doing is in applying basic principles that were found to see if they make sense in actual individual charts. And this is a little bit similar to a taxonomist seeing a new kind of butterfly or a bird or a flower, a lizard, whatever they're looking at, and seeing if the rules you have work. And looking at them, you look at a butterfly and you go, oh yeah, this butterfly fits all these rules about butterflies, but something's not, there's something unique, something different I haven't seen before. And then maybe you'll see it again with another kind of butterfly. So that's what we're doing, evidence-based practice, applying the ideas to specific cases, seeing how it works, and we're seeing some adjustments that look like they will help with the formula. And especially when we look at the quality of the music and what the person's doing, we're able to come up with clearer ideas of what's going on. So, let's look at the charts of these three people. Jimi Hendrix, Jerry Garcia, and Tori Amos. Three people with genius level musical talent. And everybody that I've looked at in studying this, who understands the music and study them, they all say the same thing. These three people are amazing, just, wow. They're doing things that are just hard to understand how people can do it. 35 vibe. We're at almost a half hour, which is my typical length for a video, so I'm going to stop here in the second video in the series. Now we get into the fun. Let's look at Jimi Hendrix. And the extraordinary 35 vibe patterns in his chart. Same thing with Jerry Garcia, same thing with Tori Amos. Three people who did not fit the original formula as well as almost every other person in that list. They all share something in common. They all have similar qualities in terms of their exceptional talent. So this is going to be interesting to look at these. Okay, I'll see you in the second. I hope to see you in the second video in the series. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.